Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are reading Hellblazer number 7. And just a little catch up on what happened in the last issue. We saw the introduction of Nergal, the demon leader of the Damnation Army. And he's also after John's new love interest, Zed, because she is involved in some way with the Resurrection Crusade, who is the group on the God side of this fight. And we saw Nergal in the last issue take 3 bodies of some neo-Nazi kids called the British Boys and form them into a giant monster that tried to kidnap Zed, but John was able to stop it in time. But this all just showed him that he definitely needs to look into the Damnation Army and the Resurrection Crusaders more, because obviously things are escalating with them and he needs to get to the bottom of it. So first things first, with issue 7, we got the cover. We see John is standing next to a man who's sitting in a chair kind of slumped over, and he's holding the man's hand and he looks kind of worried. The man has a medallion of a pentagram, and then we see some lines and wires coming out of his head, and then we also see like his spirit in agony above him floating, and it's screaming out, and there's some kind of digital noise above his head. And we see that this issue is written by Jamie Delano with art by John Ridgway. And we start off in a movie theater, and we see John is on a date with some girl we've never seen before, and as they watch the movie that looks like James Bond, John's narration says, "Above our heads, the projector fillets stale, thick air, searchlight blades dissecting the night for Zeppelins. Her name is Zed, and, masked by cheap dime store scent, she guards secrets more fascinating and immediate than the film." Then we see John's hands begin to slip under her blouse and begin massaging her chest, and the narration says, "I press my slow investigation. My fingers, like spies coming in from the cold, find rich, warm bounty snug against her skin. It's going well." Then we see Zed shift her weight and sit on John's lap, and they get a little more into it, and John's narration continues. "Like Dracula, I kiss her neck and feel stirring deep inside her, the private passion of a secret soul, this young explorer's final goal." And while this is going on, we see the movie is different than it was before. First it was James Bond, and now it's some kind of Monster of the Week movie. We also see Zed's blouse is open fully now, and John is just openly groping her in this theater. And the narration says, "Naked, revealed, she's an open book, but my hungry heart's unsated. I need a closer look." Then we see John flip Zed onto the seat, so he's now leaning on the seat with his knees, and he's facing the projector, and he's in between her legs, and she's leaning back in the chair, and he starts to remove more of her clothes. And his narration continues, "I make my moves. Kia-Ora cartoons crunch and crackle on the gum-boiled popcorn floor. Good progress, but this vampiric lust demands still more." Then we see the movie change from a creature feature to a Sherlock Holmes movie, and his narration continues. "A relentless sleuth I follow, bloodhound wet nose in snuffling excitement, on the trail of clues." Then the movie switches back to a different creature feature, and we see that the monster and the woman in the movie are actually making out. And in the theater, John and Zed are definitely getting hot and heavy, and his narration continues. "I'm unstoppable. I have no choice. I must inquire within, struggling like some vile parasite to get beneath her skin." Then we see John's hands beginning to reach under her skirt, and his narration continues. "Gently, so delicately, I search her. She squirms as my questing hands push and cleave through soft fabric, slick planes of tissue." Then we see John's eyes get very wide. It's kind of a close-up on his face. And also now there's blood on him, like on his face and his chest and his shirt and jacket. And we don't see what he's staring at, but he kind of looks confused. And then we see what he's looking at, and Zed is ripping open the skin on her chest. And John's narration continues. "Unveiling a subtle passage through the purient elastic of muscles, reading the concealed ciphers of her body to find the final zippers, with fingers as delicately fumbling as aardvark tongues tapping termites from the complex darkness of their castles." So Zed has fully pulled back not only the skin in her chest, but the muscle to reveal the bones in her ribcage. And for some reason, there's a zipper grafted in the middle of her ribcage. So John, of course, unzips it. And then in the next panel, we see him struggle to remove all the skin and muscle from the rest of her body. And his narration continues. Like some corrupt autonomist, I unfold her. Flesh falls away. She's stripped to the bone. Oiled with the clammy sweat of adolescent ardor, I reach out for the heart of the matter. And we see John touch a gold cross that's been hanging from her neck the whole time. And interestingly, it stayed on the whole time he was removing skin and flesh and everything. So now Zed is only a skeleton, and she's holding John's hand that's touching the cross, and then she begins to push his head down in between her skeleton legs. And John's narration continues. Unclothed by the cruel glare of Inquisition, shriven of mystery, her rattling frame displays a soul laid bare. So after going down on the skeleton Zed, the next panel is John making out with the skeleton. And I guess while he was going down on her, he somehow was able to get the cross away from her neck. So he's holding it out in his hand behind her, and the narration says, I am defeated, unmanned. Desire dies, shriveled by a sense of shame. I look away, up to the flickering screen where shadows dance like ghosts in the machine. And that is actually the name of this issue. And as we turn the page, we see John is awoken by a bright light that's shining in his face, and someone is yelling behind the light, Oi, wake up! And as John shields his eyes, he says, All right, turn the bloody light off. And his narration says, My mouth is rank. Sweat bathes me like the cold nicotine condensation on the carriage window. And we see that John has actually fallen asleep in a train, and apparently his face was pushed against the window for hours or something. So as he was breathing out, you see all the fog in the window as well. So as John recovers, he stands up and he says to the train attendant, who was the person who woke him up, Ugh, where the hell are we? And the attendant says, End of the line, pal. You can't sleep here. So John leaves the train and his narration says, Christ, I wish I could drive. Bloody public transport's a nightmare. And we see John leave the train station, and it is either late night or early morning because it's dark outside and there's no one on the streets. And we see John hail a taxi and get inside, and the driver asks him, Where are we going then? And John tells him, Barton Road Industrial Estate, the Weedabricks factory. So the taxi takes him there and drops him off, and as he walks towards this factory, we see a giant billboard sign that says eat up or something like that. I can't see all the words, but there's a child that's eating a spoonful of cereal. So John, for some reason, seems to be going into a cereal factory. And his narration says, The place floats in a sticky, cloying smell, hot milk and malt. A claustrophobic memory of school morning breakfast smothers the last ghosts of my dream. I don't know how Richie could stand 10 years of working here. Then we see John walking around the walls of the compound until he comes to a stairwell, and he walks up it, and there's a door that says access controls, no admittance. And as we turn the page, we see John is inside the room now, and he's being escorted around by the man who let him in named Richie. And Richie's saying to him, It's not so bad, man. Working nights, there's nobody around to bug me. Anyway, how else could I get my hands on all this gorgeous hardware? And as he says this, they walk into a control room of sorts, where there's a giant control room and computer system where Richie does all his work. And Richie continues talking to John saying, Once I had discovered how far I could hack into the electronic reality from this terminal, I soon saw the parallels with the magical paradigms. And John says to him, Far out, mate. What did you sniff out on the Resurrection Crusaders then? So it seems John has a friend named Richie who's into computers, and he just happens to have a lot of hardware at his disposal, and he has asked Richie to use this computer to look into the Resurrection Crusaders. We also see a sign above this computer that says no smoking, and right away John pulls out his cigarettes and also gives one to Richie, and they begin to smoke. And Richie says about the Resurrection Crusaders, It's well weird, John. With the out-of-the-body stuff and a bit of judicious chemogenesis, I can get my consciousness right into the computer. I can move in the fifth dimension, man. And also, I'll describe Richie right now since he's kind of a main character in this story. He's a skinny white guy with glasses. He's got a full beard and brown hair. He's got a lab coat on over his jeans and t-shirt, and the lab coat has its sleeves rolled up, and hanging from his neck on a necklace is a golden star pendant. So as Richie talks about going into the fifth dimension, John says, Yeah, I understand quantum magic, mate. Now, what did you get on the Bleeding Crusaders? And then John's narration says, He's a good bloke, Richie, and a bloody clever magician, but he does rattle on. So Richie goes over to his main computer, and he begins to type, and he says to John, It's typical fundamentalist missionary stuff in the main, a hearts and minds operation, high-profile fundraising. And as John lights another cigarette, he says, "I've worked that much out, mate, but they've got to have a secret." And Richie replies, "Well, I did get a whiff of a splinter group, Tongues of Fire they call themselves." And John says, "They are the kiddies." And Richie continues, "It was a bit dodgy in their neck of the woods. They've got some heavy technology. I suppose I could go in and have another look." And then John puts his arm on Richie's shoulder and says, "I'd appreciate it, mate. I'd go in myself, but I'd be lost in seconds. Job needs an expert." So Richie sits down in front of his computer and he grabs some suction cups that are connected to wires and he begins to stick them to his forehead. And he says, "Yeah, it's a bit tricky. I adapted this kit from a new medical development for teaching people to control stress by visualizing their brain waves onto a screen. I fiddled with the program a bit. Now, as long as I get in the right frame of mind." And right here, Richie pauses and I guess he sparks up a joint because he smokes something. We can't see it. I'm pretty sure they couldn't show this at the time. So it's all in silhouette and you can't really see what exactly he's smoking, but it's obviously supposed to be weed. And Richie continues, "I can match my alpha waves with the computer, project the electronic impulses of my consciousness across the logic gap, and slip right into limbo." And as he says this last line, we see his digital self manifest into the mainframe, I guess we'll call it. And this is utterly hilarious now, but back in the day, they didn't know what cyberspace or the internet or anything was, so they had to visualize it somehow. So usually that means circuit boards with relays and stuff as buildings in this environment of cyberspace. But I feel this Hellblazer issue shows it a little bit better than that. In the background, we do see like circuit boards and stuff, but hovering over that as his digital self manifests. And that's actually really cool because you get like the little squares appearing and eventually they make up Richie and they get finer and finer and finer until you see him fully actualized in cyberspace. And it's literally just his body is floating around in this cyberspace realm, which I guess would now be considered the internet. So as his body like congeals itself and puts itself together fully, he says, "It's pretty bloody spooky in here, I tell you, mate. But once you're in, you can go virtually anywhere." Then we cut back to John sitting in the computer room and he's waving his hand in front of Richie's face, but nothing from Richie's body registers any of that motion because I guess, he's like jacked into the Matrix. And apparently John can hear him through the computer speakers now. So he answers Richie saying, "Yeah, well, don't get lost. I'm off for a coffee." And as he's about to walk out the door, he looks back at Richie and says, "Oh, if you find yourself anywhere near a gas board accounts file, could you pay my bill?" Then we see John walking into the coffee room area, and there's like a vending machine for coffee. And as he puts some quarters in it, his narration says, "This is more my level of technology." Then we cut to the house of Ray Mondi, who is John's friend from the last issue, who was allowing Zed and John to stay at his house. And we see him handing a cup of cocoa to Zed, and she's saying, "Thanks. You're good looking after me like this." And the narration says, "Staying with Ray is like visiting a favorite granny. Zed's warm and cozy. The night is safely locked outside." And as the narration says outside, we cut to outside, and we see there are some men gathering outside of Ray's house. And through the window, we can hear Zed say, "I don't want to cause you any trouble." And Ray says to her, "Think nothing of it. Any friend of John's, as they say." And then we cut back inside and continue the conversation with Ray saying, "Anyway, you've had a bad fright. Constantine's world is a pretty scary place." And Zed asks Ray, "Have you known John a long time?" And Ray replies, "Quite a while. I met him when he first came to London. Such a strange young man." And Zed asks, Were you and he?" And Ray responds, "Do you think I'd kiss and tell?" And then he picks up a picture of someone on the mantle, and it looks like a man in uniform, and he shows it to Zed and he says, "You're right, I probably would. But fortunately, my heart belongs to another. And I'm an old-fashioned monogamous sort of chap." And Zed looks at the picture and sees that the frame is black around it, and she says, "A soldier. Does the black frame mean he's..." And Ray looks down at the picture and says, "Yes, in the bloody stupid Falklands War. He was all burned up in the Sir Galahad. Sergeant Bill was lovely. Such a joker. Used to have me in stitches." And then Ray begins to cry a little bit, and Zed says, "Oh, Ray." But Ray continues talking, saying, "You'll be the death of me, I used to say. Ironic, really, I suppose." And he says that line because if you don't remember from the last issue, Ray is an older gay man with AIDS. Also in the background, we're seeing the men who are outside gathering have now broken into the lower part of Ray's house and are quietly sneaking up the stairs towards the room Ray and Zed are in. So Zed looks up at Ray and says, "I'm so sorry, Ray. John told me that you were ill." And Ray replies, "AIDS, love. Don't be afraid to speak its name. That's what they want people to do. Push it back into the closet with all the queers and junkies. They'll only wake up when the straights start dying. Then it'll be too bloody late. But that's enough about me. Too depressing. Tell me how life's treating you." And just as he asks that, Zed hears a noise and turns around, and she sees 4 men enter the room, and she says, "Me? I think I'm in a lot of trouble." And then Ray turns around and sees the men as well, and they rush at Zed, and one of them says, "Mary, it's time for you to come with us." And as Zed throws her cocoa at the man, she says, "No chance." Then Ray tries to get in between the men and Zed and says, "Now look, dearies, you've made a mistake. This girl's not called Mary." And Zed says to him, "Don't get involved, Ray." And one of the 4 men we've seen before, I believe in issue 3, he was one of the main guys from the Resurrection Crusade that came into John's sister Cheryl's home when their daughter went missing. And this guy kind of looks like George Bush Sr. He's a gaunt, white, older man with thick-rimmed black glasses, and he wears a black suit compared to the other men who are wearing pink shirts that say Tongues of Fire on them. So the man with glasses sees Ray and says, "Silence, vile sodomite! Do you think a man does not recognize his own daughter?" And then the man with glasses looks at Zed and says, "Come, girl, it's over. The time grows near now. You must be about the Lord's work. It is your destiny." And as Zed's dad says this, Ray puts his hands up because he's still standing in between the men and Zed, like he's going to fight them. And as Zed yells out, "Ray, leave it!" one of the men of the Tongues of Fire punches Ray right in the stomach. And keep in mind, Ray is a pretty old man, and he also has AIDS, so he's probably not in the best fighting condition. And as he gets punched, Zed yells out, "No, don't hurt him! I'll come with you!" But as she walks towards her dad, he grabs her by the hair, and he grabs one of her arms and he forces it behind her back. And he begins leading her out of the room. And as this happens, she notices that even though she's cooperating with them, they're not stopping the beating of Ray. So the Tongues of Fire men begin to kick him and hit him some more, and she turns around and tries to break free, but she can't get out as she yells, "Stop them! They'll kill him!" And her dad says, "He's an abomination in the eyes of the Lord, corrupt, unnatural, lower than a beast of the field. He must be punished." And with that last line of "he must be punished," we see Ray fall to the ground as he gets kicked some more. Then we cut to the outside of his house where they're loading Zed into a van. And we see in the window that Raymondi has not gotten up from his beating. Then as we turn the page, we get a weird juxtaposition because Ray was just getting kicked to John kicking the coffee vending machine because apparently it did not work for him. And his narration says, 10 minutes and 2 quid's worth of loose change later, I still haven't got a cup of hot coffee. Just the satisfaction of knowing that the thing will never work again. And John has kicked the hell out of this thing, and it begins leaking coffee out of it, almost like it's bleeding onto the ground. And as John walks away without his coffee, the narration says, "Machines. You either understand them or you hate them." Then John returns back to Richie's body, who's still plugged in, and apparently maybe there's like a computer screen or something that's showing all these colors that Richie has seen, but there's definitely a lot of trippy colors going on in the room now. And John's narration says, "Well, the light show's improving. Richie must be getting somewhere. Hope he knows what he's doing. He was always a bit reckless in the old days." And as John approaches Richie, he says, "Is anybody in there?" And the computer speaker says, "Don't piss about, John. I've got to concentrate. I'm right on the edge of the Tongues of Fire network." And then John lights up a cigarette and he literally blows the smoke into Richie's unresponding face. And he says, "Amazing. You said that without your lips moving. Hurry it up then, mate. I've got a train to catch." And then we get a panel that's really close up on one of Richie's eyes, and you can see like we're going to go inside of his mind. And Richie says through the speakers, "I've got to go carefully here. I don't know what these boys are hiding, but it has to be big. All the approaches are booby-trapped." Then we cut to inside cyberspace, and we see Richie walking on some type of circuit board as he searches through the Tongues of Fire network. And his narration says, "Hurry it up," he says. "That's typical of bloody Constantine. He should try following a $10 pyramid of prayer donation from Liberty, Iowa, through the 20 different computer systems to an account in Barclays Bank, Glastonbury, England. And that was the easy part. This Tongues of Fire system is like nothing I've ever gotten into before. Hurry it up. Huh. He couldn't even begin to comprehend the ecstatic terror, the pure joy of total freedom to move, powered only by the engine of will, through this interminably awesome beauty. It's definitely the best buzz yet. Not that John would appreciate that. He's too damn tight-ass these days. Never been the same since Newcastle. Still, I suppose that changed us all. We all went a bit crazy after Newcastle. I wonder why he's so interested in these Resurrection Crusaders. There has to be a woman involved. John would go to hell and back if he thought there was some interesting sex in it. Now, what's this? Some kind of interface. Bloody strange one, though. They certainly don't want any unauthorized access to this system. Talk about defenses. This is a positive minefield of booby-trapped logic bombs. A wrong move here could be fatal. Ah! And suddenly there's a blinding white light on the screen that John's watching, and he says, "Richie, are you all right? You better come out now, mate. This machine looks restless." And as we turn the page, we get a beautiful double-page spread that shows Richie's cyberspace body disappearing into a circuit board that seems to be sparking with white and yellow. And as Richie's virtual body disappears, his narration says, "Synapses flash and pop, like flashbulb supernova, as the particular passion of my being is caught up in a subatomic slam dance. Consciousness is stretched by electron riptides and thinly spread through infinite spatial black, leaving thoughts, rare sleeping islands, separated by oceanic eternities. I'm stretched, elastic life, wound in a double helix around the universal pole, a string of neurons in the cosmic brain, resonant, my being tuned to everything." Then we cut to Constantine for a second, who's staring at his friend who's not moving or answering him anymore, and he says, "Richie? Come on, mate, speak to me." Then we get some more of Richie's narration saying, "Now contraction catapults my soul into a new, triumphant birth. Rhapsodic bathed in perfect grace, I sail for eons, blessed in beatific tranquility, alive in a universe of glory, at play with angels above this fierce and holy sun. But transient as elemental thought, my voyage lasts but brief millennia. Sweeping on a high, wide spiral, my ship of rapture founders, grounded on mortality's reef. Particles reassemble and memories coalesce around my swelling sense of self. I must start the long return to dull corporeality and reclaim my body's tawdry clay." So it seems Richie's mind inside of the Matrix, just thought these lights went off and he had some kind of crazy experience, but now he's got to return back to his body. But when we cut to Constantine staring at Richie, all of a sudden we see some smoke coming off of Richie's head. And John sees it and reaches out and touches his forehead, and he gets burned and he says, "Ah, Jesus, he's burning up." And John realizes what's going on. His friend Richie is about to spontaneously combust. So he looks around and he sees a fire extinguisher on the wall, and as he runs to it, his narration says, "I don't want this to happen. This isn't going to happen. I won't let it." But just as he thinks the word happen, he turns around and his friend Richie bursts into flames. And John tries to even spray him with the fire extinguisher, and his narration says, "It's far too hot for the fire extinguisher. I can't even get near. SCH, spontaneous human combustion. There have been some cases in the 14 times. Last time I saw it was in Baron Winter's house." And right there, John's actually talking about when, in the Alan Moore Swamp Thing run, John had gathered all the magical DC characters, and they had a seance because they were trying to push back this big evil that was coming. And in the middle of this magical circle, because there was so much power being channeled through them, the magician Zatara, who is Zatanna's dad, got burned up from the power as John held his hand. So John actually had to hold Zatara's hand as it was burning. So he's very familiar with the concept of spontaneous human combustion. And his narration continues. "It's horrible. In less than one crackling, scorching minute, Richie is reduced to charcoal. The acrid smell of the charnel house paints my senses with nausea, but I have to have a look. What's left is brittle, but greasy to the touch." And as John stares at the smoldering corpse of his friend, the head breaks off and falls to the ground. And just as that happens, John is very startled when he hears Richie's voice come out of the computer saying, "John? You there, John? Listen, I had a bit of a close call, but I'm okay. I'm on my way back." And John's narration says, "The shock of hearing his voice is temporary. The sinking feeling that follows realization of the implications, less so. So John begins to talk to Richie, but he doesn't really know what to say. So he says, look, mate, I don't really know how to tell you this. But he's cut off by Richie saying, you won't believe where I've been. Columbus only discovered the New World. Richie Simpson found a whole new universe. And as Richie talks, John tries to cut in saying, Richie, But Richie just keeps going saying, you ought to try it, John. Man, what a rush. Here, be a mate and get some coffee in. I'm always parched after one of these jaunts. And as Richie talks, John just looks at the burning body in front of him, and he reaches out and he grabs the smoldering remains of Richie's star necklace. And as he does this, his narration says, God damn it all to hell. Why? Why is it that lately everything I touch turns to shit in my hands? And the art doesn't show what John does with that star pendant, whether he pockets it or puts it on the ground. But we can see John is definitely thinking about something as we turn the page, because he's pulling out a cigarette, he's beginning to light it, as Richie continues to talk over the computer saying, I found the Tongues of Fire terminal, John. It's somewhere in Glastonbury. Shouldn't be too hard to track down. And as John lights his cigarette, he says out loud to Richie, good, mate, good. And we can see that John is very pained as he's saying this, and then he thinks to himself, what am I going to do? I can't let him get back into his body. He wouldn't thank me, would he? And Richie continues talking over John's thinking, saying, they've hooked into some tremendous source of primal energy. I got sucked into it. It's like, and as John begins to rub his temples and think about what to do in this situation, he continues answering Richie saying, yeah, what's it like, mate? And then he finally kind of decides what he's got to do. He reaches down and he pulls the electrodes off of the burning skull that was Richie's head. And as he does that, Richie answers his question of what it was like by saying, it's like nirvana. And as John stares at the electrodes in his hands, he begins tracing the wires back to the computer, and his narration says, how do you tell someone that his body's been burned to the ground while he was out? I mean, he's not going to be able to claim off his insurance, is he? And as John stares at the wires, Richie continues talking, saying, nearly there now. How's the coffee coming? Here, that's weird. All this has changed. This is the right place, but where's the bloody link? Constantine, what have you done? Is this your idea of a joke? And John answers him, it's no joke, Richie. And Richie replies, come on, man, you're freaking me out. And John sees the power to the computer is hardwired into a switch on the wall, so he walks over to it and says, sorry, mate. And Richie doesn't know what's going on because he doesn't know his body burned up. He just is looking for the way out where he came in. And he pleads with John saying, please, what's happened to the way out? And as John reaches over to the plug, he says, goodbye, Richie. And Richie exclaims, what do you mean goodbye? Please, John, And then John unplugs the computer. And I gotta say, this is one of the most messed up sequence of panels that I've ever read. Just, you have to kill your best friend, but he's still alive in this network and he's talking, but he has no body, so you can't explain that. So you'd rather just unplug your friend than have to tell him that his body's burned up and figure that out. And John knows he's a bastard for this because as he unplugged it, his narration says, call me a coward if you'd like, but I can't take any screaming. No flash, no bang, nothing but the black lapping darkness of the void. Then as we turn the page, we cut to a train and the sun is rising. So John has obviously left the building and is heading back. And the narration says, the dawn train lurches me back toward London, rolling a sick millstone headache around the bowl of my skull. My heart twitches like a dying beast, crawled into the rank burrow of my chest to breathe its last. I'm cold, chilled to the marrow. I daren't even shut my eyes for fear of sleep and dreams. I feel like an old soldier attending one by one the funerals of war comrades. Richie was the last of the Newcastle team. Benjamin got it first from the Involce and me. Then Gary Lester from Nemoth and me. Now Richie's incinerated by the Tongues of Fire and me. Christ, it's been 10 years. Will I never stop paying for that debacle? And as of yet, we don't really know what happened in Newcastle, so this is kind of like a teasing moment. And if you don't remember, Benjamin was actually a friend that we don't see in this book, but he's actually killed in the Alan Moore Swamp Thing run. And then we saw Gary Lester in the first 2 issues get killed by the creepy fly insect demon Nemoth. And as John lights a cigarette, trying to push all those bad memories out of his head, He looks up and he sees all the ghosts of his friends standing in the train next to him. And his biker friend Frank says, "We all got to pay our dues, man." And then Gary Lester looks at him and says, "Like you say, John, it's all a matter of personal responsibility." And as John looks at them, his narration says, "Would you credit it? The bloody ghosts are back." And as he takes a drag of his cigarette, he says to his friends, "Hello, Frank. Hello, guys. Should have known you spooks would turn up at the last whiff of disaster. Where's the other ambulance chasers?" And then he looks over to his left and he sees the ghosts of all of his other friends staring at him, and they kind of look like they're judging him. And he says, "Oh, Christ, it's the whole sick crew. Come on, then, get it over with. Carve up my conscience. Reveal me for the bastard I obviously am." And there are 3 ghosts he's talking to here, besides Frank and Gary. And there's a young woman who's, I believe, named Emma, who also died in the Swamp Thing run. But we did see her ghost earlier in this run when he went to her apartment in New York with Gary Lester. And she says to John, "You've got us all wrong." And then his friend Benjamin, who's kind of like a nerdy guy, like I said, he died during the Swamp Thing run also, says, "We want to help you solve the problem." And then the 3rd ghost is a nun who's an older woman who's dressed in the full nun outfit. I believe it's called a habit. And she says to John, "Your soul is troubled, my son. You need the help of the Lord." And at that, John actually stands up and gets in her face and says, "The way I see it, the Lord's a big part of this problem." But Emma gets up in his face and kind of points a finger at his chest and says, "The big part of the problem, buddy, is that you're too interested in satisfying your sexual appetites. You're just a dirty old man, and you're going to screw up because of it." And at this point, John can't take it anymore. He begins to freak out, and he runs towards one of the doors of the train, and the narration says, "Suddenly, the walls of the room are twisting and shaking, closing in on me. She's halfway right, of course, but I don't have to listen to her tell me. It's too crowded in here, too hot." And as he says hot, he grabs the handle of the door and he opens it. And keep in mind, the train is still speeding along. He takes a flying leap out of the train, and we can see the landscape that he's going to jump out onto. And it's just like a pasture and some farmhouses, but the train is moving very fast. And the next panel we see is just pure black. And we see John's narration say, "Silly John, very silly." Then as we turn the page, we get a full page splash of Zed sitting in a room, and she's sitting on an examination table that would be in like a doctor's office. And there's even a stainless steel cart next to her with a tray on top that has a bunch of instruments and medical objects. And we can't see her face, but she definitely has the posture of being scared or possibly shamed. And we see behind her on the wall is a glowing cross. And in front of her, as she sits on the edge of this table, are 4 men talking, one of whom we've seen before. He is the guy that looks like George Bush Sr., who seems to be some kind of powerful man in the Resurrection Crusaders. And he's talking to 2 doctors. And as Zed just stares forward, not quite looking at them, the narration says, "Like a cold speculum, a sudden nausea touches her gut. She feels him falling into black. She concentrates her will to send him strength. If she loses John, she might as well give up. She needs him, needs a friend to help her cheat her destiny. She should have told him more about the dangers, not let her tongue be curbed by shame. Too late now, though. Now she can only wait and hope." And we see the head guy from the Resurrection Crusade say to the doctors, "Can we still use her now that the sanctity of her physical temple has been violated by the corrupt conjurer?" And one of the doctors replies, "Virginity would have been preferable, but mental alignment is more important." And the other doctor says, "We'll never find a better psychological profile. I suggest intensive re-education beginning tomorrow in Glastonbury." And if you remember, that was what Richie had seen, that something with the tongues of fire is happening in Glastonbury. So as long as John is alive and didn't die when he jumped out of that train, it seems John might actually be going to the place that Zed is being sent to. But we will have to see what happens in the next issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.